All right, well, hello everyone, good to see you, and welcome to our talk today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Will Inboden. Among my other hats here, I'm the director of the Clements Center, your host for the talk today, and I'm the faculty advisor for the Alexander Hamilton Society, your co-host for the talk today. So it's my honor to introduce my good friend, Henry Now. A little bit of background for you on Henry. I first encountered him not in person, but in the archives of the Reagan Library in California. A number of years ago when I was doing research in the Reagan archives for some of my own scholarship, I kept on reading, if I might say, these very insightful memos written by a young Reagan NSC staffer, Henry Now, on international economic affairs. And I remember thinking, is this the same Henry Now who's the eminent IR scholar from George Washington University? And indeed it was. So it's a fun thing as a historian when you come across the early records of someone in the archives that you may know in a later phase of life. And that's a pleasure a number of the other historians in the audience have had or will be able to have. So as mentioned, Professor Now is currently a professor at the Elliott School at George Washington University. He's the author of a number of books, a very widely read textbook on international relations theory, a book titled The Myth of America's Decline. Let me pause on that for a second. You may think, okay, well, he must have written that recently because that's an ongoing debate, right? Well, no, he wrote that 25 years ago, published in 1990. The subtitle, Leading the World Economy into the 1990s. Just a reminder that, I think you were 12 years old at the time, right? Anyway, just a reminder that Professor Now has been engaging these debates in their recurring cycles in American history. Of course, in the late 80s and early 90s, the worries about American decline were worries that Japan was overtaking the United States. Some of you here are old enough to remember that. As a historian, I always enjoy periodizing some of these things. Now, Professor Now is here to talk to us today about his excellent new book, Conservative Internationalism. I hope all of you had a chance to purchase a copy outside if you didn't already. And there's three notable things I want to highlight about the book, which we'll be hearing from him, and why we're especially excited to host him today. First, as someone who previously wrote the textbook on international relations theory, it's exciting to see him now taking the next intellectual phase of carving out a new school of thought, a new way of approaching IR theory with conservative internationalism. Second, as a political scientist, this book represents a deep engagement with history. That's certainly one of the things we encourage with the Clements Center, these fruitful conversations between history, IR, and political science. And third, somewhat controversially within the Historical Guild, this is an effort to draw some normative principles and even prescriptions from the past, from history, and particularly with the profiles he has of these different presidents. So all of those things I just mentioned, which I applaud, are going to be contested. So we may want to hear some polite but vigorous questioning from the audience. So with that, please give a warm Texas welcome to Professor Henry Now.
Thank you very, very much, Will. It's a delight to be here. You know, when you are in the archives, you obviously can no longer claim to be young. And it does seem like some years since the Reagan days. In fact, also, by the way, in terms of just how much attention is paid to the Reagan years. Relatively speaking, not enough in my judgment. Very significant and profound years, but not topics that are studied very extensively by my colleagues in the academic world. I, of course, I can't be completely objective on the subject. I work for him, and I am very much aware of that. But I also think some of the neglect of Reagan is also ideologically driven. It's ideologically driven from the other side, and probably needs to be eventually confronted, and perhaps more faculty work on him and encourage you as students to work on him. No one has tried harder to either end wars or avoid wars than Barack Obama. But he has not succeeded. The war in Iraq continues. That's the war that was supposed to end, or that did end. The war in Afghanistan continues. And a new war now exists in Syria. Why has this happened? Well, I want to argue it's happened because we have only two main traditions that guide our thinking about America's role in the world, and they cause us to cycle back and forth into and out of the world, overextending ourselves to try to change the world, and then retreating to protect ourselves, or retreating in exhaustion because of the costs that we've incurred. Never establishing a sustained presence in the world that might reduce the probability of attack, that might improve the world, and indeed over time diminish the prospects of conflict and war. We need a third tradition, I argue, that might intermediate between the two existing traditions, and that would give us a way to stay in the world at a cost, involving military power, because there's no other way I'm going to argue that you can deal with the world the way it is, but it would be lesser cost than we will incur over the long run if we continue to cycle, if we continue to indulge our efforts in the world and then repeatedly retreat. Now, the two traditions that sort of dominate our discussion are the nationalist and realist tradition on the one hand and the liberal internationalist tradition on the other. The nationalist realist tradition, of course, is identified with Andrew Jackson originally, Teddy Roosevelt, Richard Nixon, and that tradition warns us essentially not to go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. That is, to stay home, basically take care of ourselves, either independently or in some alliances with other powers as needed, but basically to stay in this hemisphere. And not to be concerned about trying to change the character of the world, not being concerned about trying to promote democracy, for example, or even human rights around the world. That is only going to complicate matters and is not needed. So take, for example, Russia today. We should be concerned about how to get along with Russia, and not particularly concerned about how to defend freedom in Ukraine. New book by Henry Kissinger, World Order, in which he refers to, very typically realist, refers to Ukraine as a bridge. He really means a buffer state. He says it should be an outpost of neither freedom nor autocracy. It should be a bridge. Well, that means it should be a buffer state, or as Sam Huntington called it, a torn country. In other words, we should stay out of the political issues in these countries. Now, so the goal is to preserve our security and not to spread liberty or not to try to improve the world. And we followed this strategy many times in our history. After World War I, of course, after World War II, when we rapidly demobilized in Europe. After Korea, we had a period under Eisenhower where we wanted to devolve power to the rest of the world. After Vietnam, of course, when we came home with a vengeance. And of course, we tried this again after the end of the Cold War. We took a holiday from history. It always works for a while, but then eventually we get hit. We get hit by a world that doesn't go away. So we get hit by Pearl Harbor. We get hit by the Berlin blockade. We get hit by the Cuban Missile Crisis. We get hit by the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And finally, we get hit by 9/11. Every one of these episodes has ended in some greater degree of conflict and loss of life than might have been the case if we had been engaged earlier. Now, the other tradition is the liberal internationalist tradition, which is identified in some cases already at the beginning of the Republic with Thomas Jefferson. I dispute that in the book, but nevertheless, it comes to the fore significantly in the administrations of Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt. That tradition urges us to spread freedom around the world, that is to make the world safe for democracy, to increase the number of democracies in the world, and eventually to try to create a world in which countries resolve their disputes peacefully through trade and diplomacy with a very minimal, if any, reliance upon military force. In fact, military force is reduced essentially to a police force as it was supposed to operate in the case of the League and in the case of the United Nations. All right, force is military force is to be used only as a last resort. So the focus here is on how to deal with problems through negotiations and how to manage the world through focus on collective goods, through a focus on public goods, through a focus on common problems. So in this case, you don't focus directly on the questions of democracy and human rights. For example, in Ukraine, you rather focus on what you have in common with the Russians, and you build up a tradition of cooperation with the Russians, and eventually the Russians will kind of begin to see that you can resolve these issues peacefully, and over a long period of time, these diplomatic interactions will lead to a world of greater tolerance and maybe way down the line, a world of greater democracy. Now, this tradition too has been tried over and over again. We of course tried it in the League of Nations. We tried it in the United Nations. We tried it, by the way, in George H.W. Bush's masterful management of the first Persian Gulf War, which was the only significant collective security operation that we know of in history. A fantastic, display of how you run the world through a liberal internationalist orientation. Woodrow Wilson had to turn over in his grave. And up until 1991, I had to tell my students that this was all still speculative as to whether the world could ever operate like this. Well, in the case of the first Persian Gulf War, it did operate that way. We tried it again, of course, in the Clinton administration, the strategy of democratic enlargement and economic engagement during our holiday for history. And of course, we tried it last in the case of George W. Bush's post-2005 Middle East Democracy Initiative. Now again, what happens with this approach is that we eventually get drawn in so deeply and the costs rise so greatly, and eventually, of course, military power has to be applied at some point, that we exhaust ourselves, we exhaust the patience of the American people, as we have done in Iraq and Afghanistan, and so we pull back. We engage in another significant then phase of nationalism and realism. We are in such a phase at the moment. We are in a spirit of pullback in the United States. We have had it. We do not want to put American forces on the ground, boots on the ground, anywhere in the world if we can help it. Familiar, by the way, position. We've been in it before. I've lived long enough to remember it in the late 70s. We're in that kind of position now. Now, I don't think in the short run we can do very much about this. By the way, these two traditions produce this cycling. We jump in with great enthusiasm to try to change the world. Costs become too much. We pull back. Eventually, we're smacked by the world, and then we go back in again and try to see if we can't change that world. There's no grand strategy, I argue, that combines the spread of freedom with the necessary and acceptable use of less force early in order to avoid the use of large force later. And think for a moment about what our nationalism or realism or pullback cost us in the 1930s. It cost us quite a bit. You might even say our pullback in the 1990s cost us quite a bit. Out of that came the 9/11 events of 2001. All right, my argument is that we need to think about the possibility of another third tradition. I'll show you a slide in a minute which will clearly indicate that this tradition has always existed. It's there logically and historically in our experience, but it has never been developed. And that third tradition would affirm the objectives of liberal internationalism, to spread freedom and to try to transform anarchy, that is, to try to make the world a better place so that in the long run we have less conflict and less war. But it would use the means of realism to back up or to arm its diplomacy. Unlike liberal internationalism, which always says use force only as a last resort. And it would pursue an end goal closer to nationalism, all right? Namely a decentralized world of nation states that are sovereign and free and that live side by side as now more and more liberal republics, since that's what you're trying to achieve through the spread of freedom, live side by side in the so-called democratic peace. Now that alternative is one that I'd like to develop further for you, all right? And keeping in mind the contrast constantly with the nationalist, the realist, and the liberal internationalist traditions. So what I would like to do is developed this in 5 parts. What do I mean by conservative? What do I mean by internationalist? What do I mean by armed diplomacy? Very important concept here. Use of less force early, before and during negotiations, not just greater force later, after negotiations fail. George Shultz once said very insightfully that last resort means usually things have gotten pretty bad by that point. If negotiations have failed, it means things have deteriorated. So you're going to have to use more force now after negotiations fail than you might have had to use earlier to make those negotiations succeed. That is, to give those negotiations a chance of gaining the attention of your adversary. But now look, if you're going to use diplomacy, armed diplomacy, to spread freedom, how do you discipline, all right, that kind of a foreign policy? That's a fairly risky foreign policy. This is, of course, you know, the contemporary controversy about neoconservatism. I'll come back to neoconservatism in a minute. You can't do this everywhere. You can't do this always at the point of a gun. How do you discipline, all right, such an approach? Well, I think you can do that. You do that by setting priorities for spreading freedom on the borders of existing freedom, not in regions that are remote from those borders. All right, I'll explain what that means a little more in a minute. And finally, you have to be ready to compromise. You have to understand that the purpose of armed diplomacy is not to win a war. The purpose of armed diplomacy is to win the negotiations. All right, that moves the world incrementally and gradually towards more free countries and therefore towards this conservative nirvana of sovereign nations living side by side as liberal republics in peace with one another. I'll give you a few examples, although we can get to those more in the discussion period, from the presidents that I studied. Why did I choose these presidents? By the way, I chose these presidents because they were most successful in spreading freedom. They are the 4 presidents that really had more to do than any other presidents, Lincoln aside, since that was an internal issue about freedom, but in terms of spreading and consolidating freedom in the world at large, first in the on this continent and then in the world at large. And so I was eager to understand, well, how do they do this? And what's to be learned from that? Now, what do I mean by conservative? This is actually quite important because we don't hear a lot about conservative anything in the academic world. I mean, I must have been around for 20 or 25 years before I read, I first came across the term conservative realists. But I never heard the word conservative internationalists, except, by the way, to refer to realists. Some historians use that term to refer to realists, but not to people who are internationalists like me, who want to see the possibility of improving the world and creating more liberal republics in the world. So what do we, and colleagues, of course, advised me not to include this. What's this got to do with a book on foreign policy? But it's incredibly important. It tells us how presidents and how groups in the debate about American foreign policy think about politics, first domestically and then internationally, because normally they think about politics consistently across those boundaries. Now, in the case of Americans, all of us are liberals. And so this gets to be a bit confusing. Louis Hartz wrote a wonderful book many years ago. I hope some of you still read it, called The Liberal Tradition in America. And he said, in effect, look, all of us are classical liberals. We all believe in the authority of individual self-governance. And we don't believe in the authority of the church, the state, fascist or radical ideas in this country. The United States has never really had a fascist party. It's never really had a communist party. Our politics have always been, except perhaps at the time of the Civil War, because you could consider the South as being a kind of fascist government, it has always been very centrist. And the idea that somehow or other we're more polarized, we may be today than the Europeans, but that our history is one of polarization, that's just, I think, contrary to the facts. We've been extremely centrist. And we don't have these radical parties on either wing, all right? But conservatives and liberals do differ significantly on 2 important points in their understanding of politics domestically, and this translates then also to their understanding of politics internationally. Some Americans are Republican liberals, what I call Republican liberals. All right? They relatively privilege, we all believe, as I say, we're classical liberals, we all believe in liberty and equality, but Republican liberals will privilege liberty over equality. and embrace limited government. That means a government that is small in proportion to the civil society, because you want a very robust civil society, churches, neighborhoods, markets, all the things that conservatives believe in. And you see progress as a moral struggle influenced as much by virtue and religion, by moral issues, all right, as by ultimately reason and expertise, which is going to be more emphasized by social liberals. Now, it's important here to understand that why are conservatives, why do they embrace limited government? Primarily because they see the primary threat to freedom coming from government and not coming from the civil society. Now, sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. But that's the way they see the major threats to freedom, individual freedom, potentially coming from government, not from the civil society. Now, social liberals, all right, reverse that. They privilege equality over individualism. They see the dangers of to liberty coming primarily from the civil society, and therefore they want more and more government in proportion to civil society in order to root out discrimination and regulate things in the civil society. And they're much more optimistic that they can achieve progress, social progress, through the application of reason and expertise, ultimately through the application of scientific methods. And that once science tells you something is right, you can't really argue with that. There's no reason to try to look for or to have a debate about whether that's a moral choice or not. It's a given fact. Now, these are all relative differences. I think they're, by the way, very important in the debate. I'm glad we have both conservatives and liberals in this country. I wouldn't want a country in which there were only conservatives. And I've been around long enough to, I've been in some communities where there have been many more liberals than conservatives, so I certainly don't want a world in which there are only liberals. And I think that's the spirit in which we ought to embrace. These two, by the way, now think differently about the world. All right? Republican liberals think more about a world in which there's limited government, not a world in which there are a lot of international institutions. All right? And social liberals think about a world in which there's centralized government, international institutions who gradually, through bureaucratic expertise and policy studies of one kind or another, eventually regulate more and more of the international environment, just the way they prefer to see this happen in terms of the domestic environment. Now, Jefferson's a great example, by the way, of the conservative sort of orientation towards these two issues. And I won't, we can talk about that later, but let me sort of show you how you can map liberal and conservative orientations in terms of these two dimensions. I mean, here you have the reason, science versus tradition, religion, virtue axis, which is the vertical axis, and the horizontal axis, limited government, liberty government, equality, activist government. And you can then place various groups in these various quadrants. Liberals, of course, clearly in this quadrant, conservatives in this quadrant, some mix in these two. And by the way, in the book, I then go on and try to classify, show you how you can, in fact, break up conservative groups. You know, down in this direction, you can break them up into groups, relatively speaking, because some conservatives are more reform-minded than others, and therefore see a larger role for activist government, as, for example, George W. Bush did, and maybe also Richard Nixon. And you can do the same thing with liberals. By the way, I've gotten absolutely no pushback on this discussion in my book, so I think it's a fairly common way in which we distinguish ourselves. And liberals, for the most part, agree with that. Now, what do I mean by internationalist? This is another one of these major debates that we have had since the beginning of the Republic about whether we should be primarily concerned about the spread of freedom in the world or whether we should be primarily concerned about our security. It's essentially that issue that divides nationalists and realists from internationalists. All right, the nationalists essentially emphasize security and de-emphasize, all right, democracy and the prospects for altering political ideas around the globe. And they're very pessimistic about that. Don't think it's likely to happen. They would prefer simply to focus on what is needed in order to provide for national security. Nationalists, by the way, are minimalist realists. That is, they worry mostly about the borders, maybe the Caribbean, maybe a few other places in the Western Hemisphere, but they don't want to worry about anything else. Realists are a little bit more willing to think about managing the balance of power elsewhere in the world in order maybe to preempt threats that might eventually affect this hemisphere. For example, like a hegemon emerging in Europe or a hegemon emerging in Asia that might then take advantage of our interests in this hemisphere. All right, internationalists reverse the emphasis and tend to emphasize more the spread of freedom and de-emphasize military force, regarding it only as a last resort and being, of course, very eager and supportive of arms control arrangements, efforts to try to reduce the number, of military arms in the world. Now, which of these should we favor? Well, again, I don't think there's any answer to this. I learned a lot from Ronald Reagan, who actually embraced a combination of both of these positions. He always started from the nationalist position, all right, in which he said, look, if we lose freedom here at home, where do we go? Think about that one. That was a pretty pithy insight, I think. If you are, if you lose freedom in Iran or if you lose freedom in Vietnam, you come here. If we lose freedom here, where are we going to go? Some of my students say Sweden. Well, okay, maybe Sweden's not going to accept it, however. Not going to accept the large numbers that might want to go to Sweden at that point. So he was very conscious of the need to preserve freedom at home. But then he warned us, of course, that we could not, because America is not just a place, but also an idea. He warned us that we could not separate ourselves from the moral struggles of the world. He gave his famous speech in March of 1983, in which he said, look, we have to take a stand on these struggles that are going on, these moral struggles that are going on in the world, between freedom and despotism. Now, one of the reasons I think Reagan had an important insight here is if you think historically, when we have pursued both kinds of freedom, that is, when we've cared about it at home and abroad, we've made enormous progress. This is the period after World War II, when we, of course, carried the banner of freedom around the world, and we made more progress on civil rights in this country than we ever did before. Consider the 1920s and 30s, when we didn't care much about the plight of liberty abroad, nor did we seem to care much about it at home. The KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, peaked in those years with 30,000 of them. I mean, those pictures on YouTube are just astonishing. Marching down Pennsylvania Avenue in the late 1920s in their hoods and their sheets. And that was perfectly all right. They were just an interest group, like any other interest group. So I think, there's something to be said for thinking about these two always in terms of America being both a place, a very special place, since if we lose freedom here, where do we go? But also being an idea that transcends this place and therefore inevitably associates with the struggles for freedom going on in the rest of the world. But it's perfectly reasonable for people to take a different view on that. Just like it's perfectly reasonable for people to divide on the conservative versus liberal dimension. There's no heresy here. We're trying to understand an American debate which is all American. All right. What do I mean by armed diplomacy? Now this gets to be the interesting part of the conservative international orientation. Because the question is, if you're going to be serious about pursuing freedom, then conservative internationalists are going to say, look, you can't be satisfied with simply using military force as a last resort, because you're going to get pushback from despots. You're going to get pushback from autocratic societies, just like we're getting pushback today from Russia and from China. And they're going to use force much more readily than you. They use force every day to maintain their positions at home, and they're more likely to use force in relationships with you. Again, Reagan had a great way of putting this. He said, if they treat their own people this way, how do you think they're going to treat us if they get the chance? Right? So there is a greater propensity. A lot of our political science research confirms that propensity for autocratic societies to use force more readily. And you're going to have to be serious then if you are going to try to expand incrementally the domain of freedom. You're going to have to get serious about how you counter force. All right, and that leads to this requirement to arm your diplomacy. That is, you must think about how you can use military force. I'm not just talking about military intervention here, as you'll see, but how you can use military force both before and during negotiations, all right? Not just after negotiations fail. Now, there's a very big argument here, and it's a good argument. Liberal internationalists would say, look, if you use force before and during negotiations, what's the likelihood you're going to get any agreements? I mean, you're just going to provoke your adversary. But then conservative internationalists respond and say, yeah, but if you don't use force before and during negotiations, and your adversaries do, then by negotiating from a liberal internationalist perspective and committing yourself to use force only as a last resort, they're going to go proceed to negotiate with you while they achieve their objectives outside negotiations. I mean, think to some extent about Putin today. He's happy to negotiate, or think about Iran. It's happy to negotiate, but it is marching steadily forward towards achieving its objectives by using force outside the negotiations. That is, moving toward a threshold nuclear capability, supporting the radicals in the Middle East, in Syria, Hezbollah, Hamas, Jordan, and other places, in order to shift the balance of power in the Middle East. This is all going on while the negotiations are taking place. So how do you counter that sort of thing? The Soviet Union, of course, was doing this regularly outside negotiations. You have to be willing to use force. Now, you use force in three ways, I argue in the book, and find that in the policies of these presidents I studied, this played a very important role. You use force as background leverage, all right, to, I don't know what happened to my laser here, but as background leverage to increase the adversary's interest in negotiations and to set the agenda for negotiations. All right, this was Reagan's problem with détente in the late 70s and early 80s. All right, he wasn't in a position of strength to really set the terms for the negotiations with the Soviet Union. And he wasn't going to negotiate until he was. So he developed this background leverage. By the way, Truman did the same thing in 1950, remember, before the Korean War, all right, and decided to significantly increase military expenditure and to put the negotiations with the Soviet Union on hold, all right, on hold. And he did that in good part because he recognized that we were at that point slipping in our capacity to balance or counterbalance Soviet power, and we needed to make sure that we had in place the military capability, the background leverage, in order to negotiate effectively. All right. Secondly, you use leverage. You use military power as leverage on the ground. That is, when your negotiating adversary tries to achieve some objectives outside the negotiations by using military force, you push back. All right. Truman, by the way, did this in the case of the Berlin airlift. All right. When all of his advisors told him to get out of Berlin, can't really defend it. Soviets have got it surrounded. It really doesn't make any sense. Truman said just the opposite. He said, gentlemen, we stay, period. All right, this is the moment from which we will start pushing back if the Soviets continue to operate, continue to exert pressure to achieve their objectives. Reagan's freedom fighters in Central America, in Afghanistan, in Southern Africa, they were also designed to do the same thing, simply to suggest that, look, you better get serious in the negotiations because you're not going to be able to make significant progress outside of those negotiations. Now finally, military force in diplomacy is crucial for bargaining inside the negotiations. You have to have something to trade off. And Reagan was very insightful on this. By the way, some excellent new books, which I recommend highly to you, that have now been done on the basis of declassified documents, but a great book by Martin and Annalise Anderson, show how Reagan was very clear from the very beginning about the fact that we were not going to get the Soviets' attention on INF until we deployed our own INF weapons. We had none. Why would they give up theirs if we had none? But he also said from the very beginning, if they're willing to stop anywhere between what they've already deployed and the zero that at this point we have deployed, he said this in December of 1981, we'll negotiate with them. All right, so he was clearly willing to accept any number between zero and what the Soviets had already deployed by that time. But he said, you know what? They won't negotiate anything until we start deploying. Eventually, of course, the NATO countries deployed, and what happened? Got the Soviets' attention, and before you know it, we had eliminated, all right, all of the INF weapons. And the only agreement, by the way, the only arms control agreement that has done that, to eliminate a whole classification of weapons in December of 1987. Now, this is risky. I'm not going to, make any, I'm not going to suggest otherwise. Right? I'm just going to argue that any other alternative in the longer run is probably riskier and potentially costlier. I may have trouble proving that because, by the way, if you use force early and you preempt the use of the need to use a lot of force later, you can never prove it. And that's a very big problem in terms of persuading the public, all right, to look at this problem in this manner. But here is what you get now, and this shows you kind of the gap that I was talking about at the beginning, the missing tradition. But here's what you get if you simply juxtapose these two differences in emphasis that I've just laid out between nationalists and realists on the one hand and internationalists. All right, they differ in terms of whether you pursue security or it's not on the, doesn't come up, but anyway, democracy is down here. Whether you give the emphasis to democracy or to security, and then whether you give the emphasis to diplomacy or force. These are all relative differences, but I think very important relative differences. And what happens is you get these, quadrants of orientations, all right? And we have plenty of literature on nationalists, on realists, on liberal internationalists. We have practically nothing in this quadrant under conservative internationalists. Proof of that, by the way, is that when some liberal internationalists during the Cold War became disillusioned with the liberal internationalists' excessive emphasis on diplomacy and lack of sufficient emphasis on force, what did they do? They migrated over into this quadrant. I'm talking about Senator Scoop Jackson, all right, and Jeane Kirkpatrick, the neocons. Here's where the neocons came in. They simply sensed that there was something, another position that you could take, all right, in this debate about American foreign policy. What happened to some realists after the end of the Cold War? I'm thinking here of Condi Rice and of Charles Krauthammer. They finally said, you know what, we've got to be willing to go around the world, not just to beat people over the head for the status quo, to maintain the status quo. We've got to give them something better to work on. They became the so-called democratic realists. They migrated from the realist box into the internationalist box. They started talking about a balance of power tilted toward freedom. Right? In other words, realizing you got to do something else other than just preserve the status quo. And those groups eventually sort of migrate into this area and wander around in this area over the last 2-3 decades, but without a tradition that is articulated that they can associate with. Not all conservative internationalists are neoconservatives. I mean, I was never a card-carrying neoconservative. People at the Heritage Foundation were never card-carrying neoconservatives. They supported a lot of the Reagan administration's policies, but they were, you could call them more traditional conservatives, all right? And yet they are, in fact, very solidly in this quadrant. Now, fourth point, and I'm going to finish up here quickly. As I suggested, it's risky, all right? And there's no question about that. So how do you discipline, all right, an orientation that says that, look, you're going to have to arm your diplomacy to deal successfully with despots if you're serious about spreading freedom, but how do you do that in a way that is tolerable to the American people? Every time we push this too far under, in the past, of course, we've exhausted the support and the will of the American people. Well, I argue you have to set some priorities, and you do that by what I call in the book geo-ideology. In some ways, it's a play off of realism and how it sets certain priorities, by geopolitics. Worry about the great powers, not about the small powers. All right, well, in the case of conservative internationalism, what I'm arguing is you need to worry about freedom where it already exists and where it is strong and powerful. You need to worry about freedom on two main borders in the world, all right, between the free countries of Europe and Russia. And if you need any proof of that, you see what's going on today on that border. There is a struggle going on there. And you need to worry about the border between free Asia and China, maybe / North Korea. Those are the two main borders of freedom. If you lose freedom on these borders, the consequences are very significant. Right? Much more significant than if you lose freedom in Iraq or in Afghanistan. And secondly, you have much more going for you on these main borders than you do elsewhere. You've got strong democracies, all right, on one side. Strong alliances, think of NATO. Strong economies, think of the European Union. In Asia, think of the alliances, think of the powerhouse of Japan and the United States and the other economies, capitalist-oriented economies in Asia, and you can see that you got a great chance to win that battle, all right, for freedom on these borders, all right. Where's that battle now being fought today? It's being fought, I think, in Ukraine. It's being fought in Turkey. By the way, it's not being fought in Syria. It's not being fought in Libya. It's not being fought in Afghanistan. It's being fought, in fact, in Ukraine and Turkey. Extremely important country, Turkey, and we've relatively neglected it over the past couple of decades. And it's being fought, by the way, on the Korean Peninsula in Asia. Because however the Korean Peninsula goes in the next 25 years, so will Asia go. When, in fact, that peninsula at some point is unified, and if you believe as I do that at some point the situation will come to a head in the north. The question is, will it tilt then towards the free countries of Asia, or will it tilt towards China? Now there is a third border, however it's minor in my judgment, and that is around the borders of Israel. Israel is of course the only real democracy so far in the Middle East, and we need to be very careful in that area, I argue. All right, we need to stand behind Israel as long as it is a democracy, but we should be very wary of any efforts to try to spread democracy in the Middle East. I mean, we tried that, and we saw just how difficult it is, and how high the costs are. All right, how high the costs are. It's not that these countries couldn't become democratic. There's no, nothing critical about the possibilities of liberal politics in those countries. It's just that it will cost a hell of a lot more than it will on the borders of existing freedom, and you can't entertain all costs. You have to be willing to set some priorities. Now, in the last decade, I argue in the book, the United States has done just the opposite. That is, we've expended enormous resources, all right, in remote regions like Iraq and Afghanistan, as we did earlier in Vietnam, not succeeding very well. We're leaving governments behind in Iraq and Afghanistan, as we did in Vietnam, that are just as weak as they would have been if we had left 10 years ago. If we'd have gone in, dealt with the threat. There was a threat in Afghanistan. That's where 9/11 came from. And if you believed at the time, as did most of the intelligence agencies, that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, there was a threat. We should have gone in, dealt with the threat in both cases, but we should not have stayed. We should have learned something from Vietnam. And I would argue that for the future, it should be clear to us that we should stay out of long wars in remote areas. You're going to have to still deal with threat from time to time. You can't let a terrorist attack from Afghanistan simply go, and we can't let the possibility of the Islamic State creating training camps that train terrorists to strike us again. You can't simply let that go. But you deal with the threat and you get out. You don't stay for the long term. Don't try to build nations. Don't try to promote democracy. You maybe get a little bit better government in place. Obviously, that's what you do. Put a little bit better government in place. But then get out. And by the way, you might be able to go back in 5 or 10 years if the situation should require it again. Today, we could never go back in. I mean, we're struggling with that today in Iraq. We'll see if we can put boots back on the ground in Iraq. I doubt it. Now, finally, and this is the last point, equally important, you have to be willing to compromise. And here maybe is where there's the biggest difference with some neoconservatives. The purpose of military leverage is to achieve a diplomatic solution in negotiations. It's not to win a war in some sort of conventional sense. This is what the hardliners in the Reagan administration didn't understand. Right? This is what the Weinbergers in the Reagan administration did not understand. Of course, thankfully, Ronald Reagan did understand, all right, and knew that what he wanted to do was to build up military leverage, and possibly at that moment when your military leverage is at its peak, you trade it off, all right, for a conclusion, for a compromise that moves things significantly in your direction, but maybe not all the way. You get 60% instead of 100%. You know, Reagan used to say repeatedly, take a half a loaf. If you know, you can't get the whole, and go back tomorrow or the next day and work for the rest. Now, so the objective is not military victory. If that's the objective, then you're buying into, because that's unconditional surrender, then you're buying into unconditional nation building. You're buying into the need to have to restore that country from scratch. This is what happened, of course, in the case of Iraq. Now, we did that in Germany and Japan, but remember, they were on the borders of existing freedom at the time, all right? They really counted. And we made an effort, by the way, always, of course, assisted by a massive Soviet threat that ultimately succeeded. But in remote regions in particular, seems to me the objective is to build up your leverage, use it quickly, and then get out. By the way, George H.W. Bush did that in the first Persian Gulf War. That is, he used the leverage of the successful military action in the spring of 1991 immediately to convene a Madrid conference, out of which then came, indirectly, the Oslo Accords. More progress at that moment that made on the Arab-Israeli dispute than at any other time in the history of Israel. So, of the existence of Israel. So, he knew when to use his leverage. George W. Bush, I'm afraid, didn't do that. He waited 4 years to launch a Middle Peace initiative after the Iraq invasion in 2003. And apparently, I don't know the details of this, but he may have missed a chance to negotiate with Iran in the summer of 2003, when Iran gave indications that they were a little worried now about the possibility that this military juggernaut might affect them, and they might have been willing to negotiate something related to their nuclear weapons. You use that military leverage when it's at its peak. And by the way, the best example of that, and in the negotiations, by the way, you give your adversary, as Reagan used to say, give them a vision of a better world. You know, let them see a little better world. I mean, he started that immediately, by the way, in his administration, talking about a world without nuclear weapons. A world in which you would reduce all offensive nuclear weapons. And then, of course, he talked repeatedly after the negotiations started about Russia joining, Soviet Union joining the globalized world economy and the future they could have in that context. So you try to fashion a compromise that is ultimately acceptable to the negotiating partner. And that's difficult, all right? That's one of the difficult aspects of this approach. For example, try to think of what sort of negotiated outcome could you support today with respect to Assad. What, of course, is not, it seems to me, logical, is to argue that we have to get rid of Assad, but we don't have anybody to replace it with. If you don't have anybody to replace it with, and if you aren't willing to take any risks to support anyone in opposition to Assad, then you got to work with Assad. And you got to negotiate with Assad. We seem to be there at this point. So the question is then, what kind of a deal would you envision that could possibly be in Assad's interest that would nevertheless, over time, weaken Assad? Because that's the objective. And how do you use military leverage, all right, to achieve that? I won't go into it, but Polk, he was one of the fascinating, presidents that I came across in this book. He was really a master at marrying force and diplomacy, never took a step with force without an accompanying diplomatic initiative, never took a diplomatic initiative without backing it up with a threat of force if it didn't succeed. He was really good at that. Ultimately, he was also terrific at knowing when to use his military leverage. We, of course, sat in control of Mexico, the entire country. We were in Mexico City in February of 1848. We could have stayed. Walt Whitman was urging him to keep 60,000 troops in Mexico. Lots of people in Congress were urging Polk at that time to go ahead and stay in the country, teach them how to, kind of an early version of Woodrow Wilson, teach them how to build better governments. But what did Polk do? Boy, he took an agreement that was negotiated by an envoy he had actually fired a few months earlier because he had exceeded his instructions. He took that agreement, it met his bottom line, he went to Congress, he pushed it through in 3 weeks, and in 6 months he had every American soldier out of Mexico City. I wonder if anybody told that story to George W. Bush when we went into Iraq. Terribly important. Okay, well, let me stop there. You get the picture, I think, and we can go into some of the individual crises that we face today in terms of the details of how this approach might guide your thinking as to what you would do in those situations. But clearly you are differently oriented in all of the ways I've suggested from the existing traditions. It does, it seems to me, provide a true alternative that entails risks, to be sure, but every one of these entail risks. Every one of the other traditions entail risks, significant risks. And I think in the long run, conservative internationalism may well entail the smallest risks. Because if you are successful in using force early in order to avoid the need to use a lot of force later, you will have, in fact, saved the country a great deal of conflict and of loss. Okay, I will take questions, and small enough group and classroom.